Hello, my name is Gail Gasior. I'm a director here at Hologic in San Diego, my hometown. I've been here 11 years. Today, I will talk to you about where I work and what my job is. I'll tell you how I got here, hint, school. I hope to tell you more about why I think my job is so cool. It combines science, math, law, writing, all into one, plus travel. It's a steamy job indeed. Within Hologic, I work in the Diagnostic Solutions Division here on Mira Mesa Boulevard. Our division of Hologic manufactures diagnostic tests for viruses, bacteria, and other pathogens that cause diseases like COVID, AIDS, hepatitis, and chlamydia, to name a few. I work in the Research and Development Department in the group responsible for conducting clinical trials. My department colleagues include biostatisticians, data programmers, data analysts, medical writers, project managers, and people who interact with doctors and nurses during the clinical trial. Clinical trials are experiments that are the best way to find out if a new test that has never been sold before works like it's supposed to. Clinical trials are done by Hologic to prove to the United States Food and Drug Administration, or US FDA, that our tests are safe and effective to use. Only after we have proven to FDA our tests work that we are allowed to sell our tests. Other countries where our tests are sold have similar requirements. My job title is the Director of Clinical Compliance. What does that mean? Well, FDA has created federal laws that describe in detail how we need to prove our tests work. There are laws over who our clinical trial subjects can be, how they are selected, and how we make sure the data that we analyze and collect is accurate and true. There are also laws over how and what we tell clinical trial subjects their rights are when they volunteer to be in a clinical trial, what will be done with their samples as we do our research, and how we keep their medical information confidential. Since there are so many laws that are unique to clinical research, my job was created to help the researchers with interpreting and applying these laws to their work. How did I get here? School. When I sat down to plan this talk, I counted I have attended 12 schools since I was 3 years old, 11 of them here in San Diego. Elementary school in City Heights, out in Crest, Warner Springs, Palomar Mountain, Palma Valley. I went to Fallbrook High School, go Warriors, and I took summer school at Caltech, a college in Pasadena. Then I went to University of California, San Diego, UCSD, Mesa College, National University, and UCSD Extension. School. Going to 5 elementary schools was good and not so good. When I went to Warner Springs, I could skip 4th grade. When I went to the school on Palomar Mountain, it only had about 50 kids, K through 8, in 2 classrooms. I was the only 8th grader. We had at least 4 teachers my 8th grade year, I can recall. I remember they always wanted to start over in the math book to see where I was at. By the time I graduated, though, I didn't have the math skills for high school. And since I was the only 8th grader at the Palomar Mountain School, they sent me to the Palma Valley School to graduate with the class there. One of the teachers, Mr. Gibson, drove up the mountain to tutor me in math all that summer so that I could be ready to start pre-algebra in the fall at Fallbrook. Fallbrook is over 40 miles and well over an hour bus ride between Palomar and Fallbrook. And it was huge to me my freshman year. It was by far the biggest school I had ever been to. It was great to take so many classes in so many different classrooms. World history, biology, Spanish, English, and yes, pre-algebra. I loved PE, hockey, field hockey, volleyball, tennis, swimming, softball. A downside of living on the mountain, though, was I couldn't play on a team or do after-school student government, things like that, or volunteer since there wasn't a late bus. But an upside was that since my stepfather, who worked at Palomar Observatory, which was owned by Caltech, I was able to go to summer school and attend chemistry and physics classes there over 2 years and get an experience of what college might be when I got there. So I was accepted to UCSD at Third College, which is now Thurgood Marshall College, and I started my freshman year 2 months after I turned 17. The same week I started UCSD, I started working at a biotech company near campus called Hybritech, a company that makes diagnostic tests similar to ones we make at Hologic. To pay tuition, I had to take out loans, I had to work. My grandparents helped me because I didn't have good enough grades to get a scholarship. My job title at Hybritech was Lab Support 1. I collected dirty glassware the scientists used in the lab and their biohazardous trash, which had to be contained in special bags and put in a steam autoclave to sterilize before it could be thrown away. I had to restock shelves, I cleaned lab equipment, I made solutions that the scientists used for their experiments, and I made many, many good friends, many of which I have today, including my husband. My freshman year at UCSD, I majored in biochemistry, cell biology, and I took 4 classes. I had always had 6 or 7 academic classes in high school, so I thought no problem. By the end of my first year, I was on academic probation. I struggled balancing school and work and a social life that I had never had before. I felt bad and frustrated and guilty that I had spent money on classes that I flunked. But that led me to a terrific counselor who explained that if I went to a junior college like City or Mesa and got A's and B's, I could get back into UCSD. And he encouraged me not to focus so much on my major, but to get my core classes done, language, math, science, at Mesa, so that I didn't have to take them at UCSD. And as mortified, as embarrassed as I was that I had flunked out, going to Mesa at that time was the best thing I could have done. They were on a semester system instead of a quarter system. They had smaller classes, and it cost a lot less. So I went to Mesa for 3 semesters. During that time, I continued to work at Hybritech. I was assigned more complicated tasks to help the scientists. I got to go to meetings with them to discuss their experiments with the senior scientists who they reported to. There were meetings that I went to where the executives who started the company talked about exciting plans for Hybritech's tests. And those tests at the time included tests to monitor recurrence of cancer, like prostate cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, in patients who had already been diagnosed. About 2 years after I started at Hybritech, a big pharmaceutical company, Eli Lilly, bought us with plans to use the diagnostic technology in their cancer therapies. This created a lot of buzz in local media. News stations would come and interview our executives about Hybritech and other companies that were being called Biotech Beach because they were all up by UCSD and along Torrey Pines Road. And these companies were creating breakthrough technologies from research done by scientists at UCSD, and Scripps, and Salk Institute. And it amazed me that the same friends at Hybritech who I went to parties with and late night Roberto's runs with were these people that were making all of this happen. It was really exciting, and I really enjoyed working there. At UCSD, though, I was still struggling. The upper division, higher level science classes required for a cell biology, biochem major required hours of labs on top of classroom work. I couldn't balance the lab requirements and work. I went back on academic probation, which led to another good counselor giving more good advice. She suggested I change majors to do something without labs, whatever I could get my degree in so that I could graduate. My grades were good in literature, in social science, in writing. Get my degree in something I was good at and interested in, and continue to work at Hybrid-Tech to learn science and apply science. It had never occurred to me I could major in something besides science if I wanted to work at Hybrid-Tech or a company like it. I changed my major to history. My boss, Jill, had always been supportive of my schedule changes and sympathetic to my challenges at UCSD. She was also all over me when I made mistakes and was distracted and not giving my best. That woman got me into clinical research in an unexpected way. I worked for Jill for almost 5 years. She celebrated my successes, scolded my failures, encouraged me to try harder. She had to defend me one too many times for making a mistake that caused the failure of many experiments. One day I came into work and she had a copy of a job description for a data entry clerk in the clinical research department. As a data entry clerk, I would be tasked with entering information about patients who were tested with our prototype cancer test from paper forms into computer databases. The results of the analyses of these data were written up and provided to FDA as evidence that our tests worked. So I started reporting to a scientist who had a PhD in neuropharmacology from UC Santa Barbara. She was hired to write the plan for the clinical trial of a test called prostate-specific antigen, or PSA. Hybrid-Tech scientists believed the test could help diagnose prostate cancer in men. I saw Paula working to plan the study, reading medical journals to understand how PSA, which is a protein found in blood, was determined to be associated with prostate cancer. She met with lab scientists to understand how the test detected protein and how the test was run by the people in the lab. She traveled to conferences where researchers and doctors from medical schools and hospitals who specialized in prostate cancer gathered to talk about working with them on Hybrid-Tech on the clinical trial. She met with our biostatisticians to calculate how many people would need to provide samples and medical history for our clinical studies to prove to FDA that our test worked. She met with sales and marketing people to understand what doctors felt they needed in a new test to help patients the most, and how much insurance companies would be willing to pay for that test. She met with people who were experts in clinical trial laws to make sure that her plan met FDA's requirements. It struck me she had to know so many things about so many other things besides science to do her job. And Hybrid-Tech didn't make products that had anything to do with her neuropharmacology PhD. Paula always challenged me to support the clinical trial in areas beyond data entry. She assigned me to read medical journals and outline how the published study was set up. What was the patient population like? What were the study results? And what statistics did they use to make their conclusions? She had me look up relevant regulations and identify where they were being met in the clinical trial plan. I really liked the work, and she gave me tons of positive feedback and encouraged me to continue in clinical research. I feel like she opened up the doors of clinical research to me, rolled out the red carpet, and laid shining stones on my path that she encouraged me to pick up and run with. Other people in the department were very supportive, but they challenged me too. They knew I wasn't pursuing a science degree. The leadership in my department were 4 women all with PhDs in different scientific fields. They would ask me detailed questions about my work, and often I had to do presentations on the status of the clinical trial in front of them and others in the department. When I finally graduated with my bachelor's degree in history, I was ready to go full-time. At a great time that the clinical trial was starting to ramp up, the project was moving fast. But I learned when a big company like Eli Lilly buys a small company like Hybritech, lots of things usually change. One of the changes was a hiring freeze. I could keep my job at 20 hours a week, but they couldn't hire me full-time. That was really bad news for me. And Paula and my colleagues in the department were very disappointed too, because the work was there and I could do it. But I had to get a full-time job. A relative that taught at Brawley High School in Imperial Valley suggested I pursue a teaching credential, regardless of where my career path took me. Teaching, he said, was a skill that will serve you and serve others. I knew he loved teaching high school biology, and I had great memories of high school. So I went to National University for a secondary teaching credential to teach high school students. I could take classes in the evening and work during the day. Another way, a great way that my colleagues in the department supported me was suggesting that I tutor. They referred me to friends who had kids that were needing some help in English or reading, and this helped me both with my finances and getting teaching experience. I started student teaching at Stanley Middle School in University City. You guys were in middle school not that long ago. I don't think I need to spend too much time telling you what middle school is like. Mid-year, the hiring freeze at Hybritech lifted, and they offered me a job as a clinical research assistant, full-time with medical and dental benefits that I hadn't had since I left home when I was 17, paid vacation, and a way to save for retirement. I felt weird and bad about leaving teaching at that moment. I had spent money towards a credential I didn't get. The principal of Stanley was understandably mad that I quit, especially when he had expressed doubt hiring me to begin with. He saw on my transcripts that I had flunked classes and I had taken incompletes, and he questioned if I was up to the task of teaching. I still felt like I had a clearer career path that I got so many benefits from and got so much out of if I accepted the offer from Hybritech, so I did. Paula continued to lay a path for me in clinical research. She was utterly focused on managing the clinical trial, and there was a ton of work to do. This was when I started to talk with and exchange emails with doctors and nurses at the clinical trial sites. The sites were different medical centers all across the United States: Seattle Veterans Administration Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Washington University in St. Louis, UCLA Medical School, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. The doctors were urologists whose patients were men seeking treatment for prostate disease, some of whom would be diagnosed with prostate cancer. Besides seeing patients, these doctors were interested in the biomedical research that would help them care for their patients. And that's why they wanted to work with Hybritech on the clinical trial. When I communicated with them, I wrote about the status of the study, and I asked questions about the data they provided. I learned to do calculations from the database. I learned to graph the test results over time and program statistical analyses to compare test results between the groups of patients to see where our test was working and where it was not. All of these outputs needed writing around them to explain what we were analyzing and what were our conclusions, and if anything in the study needed to change. That particular study went on for almost 2 years. I continued to work for Paula for over 20 years. In that time, I worked with her on 5 other clinical trials and many other projects in our department. In that time, she kept putting more and more shining stones in front of me. I was assigned to be the person who traveled to the clinical trial sites to meet the doctors and nurses who see the patients in our trials and provide the samples and data, the work that she had done previously. I trained people at the clinical trial sites on the plan for the clinical trial, including making sure they told their patients who volunteered to be in the clinical trial everything about the plan. I would visit them every 2 or 3 months to make sure they did what they were saying they did. Planning and conducting all of this training really applied many of the teaching skills that I had learned at National University and during my student teaching. There were clinical trial sites in Europe. I learned a great deal about how to travel, which is an education in itself. I saw places I would never visit on vacation, like a city called Kuopio in central Finland, where I visited in January one year, where it was -15 centigrade for a week and the sun never came up. As I gained more experience, I was promoted to staff scientist at Beckman Coulter. Also during that time, our part of the company that used to be Hybritech was sold by Lilly to Beckman Coulter. At that time, in that transition, I was asked to participate in writing detailed procedures for the conduct of clinical trials across the company according to FDA's laws. This was great experience for me that got me into reading regulations and interpreting them in ways that I could write instructions that the whole company could use for the clinical studies. This experience brought me to another crossroads when I was asked by a friend to apply for a job at another company called GenProbe, which was founded in part by executives from Hybritech. Even though I had continued to learn and grow so much with Paula as my boss and my mentor, and it was very, very hard to separate after so many years, the opportunity to work in an area of clinical research that involved interpreting regulations and the opportunity to directly manage people was one that I didn't want to pass up. That job was Clinical Compliance Manager, which is the title that I had 11 years ago. So much was similar at first, thanks to the people I knew from Hybritech, from Lilly, from Beckman, who now all worked at GenProbe. The clinical trials were similar to the kind that I had done previously, and I still traveled to sites, but this time to review the work of other clinical researchers who do the job that I did at Beckman Coulter. But now, instead of primarily working with people outside of the company, like at the clinical trial sites, I was working with people in my own department and other departments that make up the company. Instead of just working within my department of people in clinical research, I was starting to work more and more outside that comfortable place with people in other departments I really had no experience in, like engineering, sales, marketing, finance. Also similar was the change that happens when one company buys another company. GenProbe was bought by Hologic. And just like my life before, change is good and change is not so good. Where the first part of my career I had just a few bosses, in this new phase there were many, many more. And like my life before, they frequently needed to start in the book all over again to understand where the employees were and what we needed to do to determine next steps. This led to challenges and successes. Working outside the department as I was promoted, I worked with more senior directors and executives. They laid down shining stones for me as well. A few years ago, a vice president nominated me to work on an international committee that set standards for medical devices like diagnostic tests. I was asked to participate in an organization of medical diagnostic manufacturing companies that works with the United States Congress to improve the laws for clinical trials. I give talks on best practices for conducting clinical trials for diagnostic tests at conferences and trade shows attended by other manufacturers from around the globe. What I do now in clinical research is a lot different than from what I started doing, that's for sure. But what is the same is I work around tons of dedicated people from so many different backgrounds, academic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, younger and older generations, men and women, who uses their differences to create a whole company that I think makes a big positive impact on human health, more now than ever that we have gone through the COVID pandemic. Clinical research is not just science. As I said at the start, it's a career where science, math, law, writing all come together. Everyone at Hologic has to have a love of science, but you don't have to major in it to be a part of Hologic and contribute to medical research and human health care. I hope you found this interesting and informative, and that you keep on looking for shining stones to guide you down a career path, no matter where it takes you. Thank you. The following slides include a list of websites, terms, and other references on topics I mentioned in my career talk.